It was 1 o'clock in the morning when my world fractured. The knock on my door wasn't a knock. It was a desperate plea. There on my doorstep stood my only daughter, Alice, battered, broken, and betrayed by the man she loved. She collapsed in my arms, and through her sobs, she uttered the words that sealed her husband's fate. He did this for his mistress. Her husband, Stephen Hayes, was a celebrated genius, a titan of the tech world, a man who charmed a nation. But in that moment, he had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he had only broken my daughter. He had no idea that he had just declared war on her mother. My name is Jean Holloway, and I am a federal judge. This is the story of how I used every ounce of my power not for revenge, but for a judgment he would never see coming. Before we begin, if you believe that justice should always find a way, then you're in the right place. Make sure you subscribe to our channel, Ken's Story, hit that like button, and leave a comment below letting us know if you've ever had to fight for someone you love. Your stories matter here. Now, let the proceedings begin. The rain that night was relentless, a typical Washington D.C. downpour that lashed against the old windows of my Georgetown home. It was the kind of night where the city's ambition felt washed away, leaving only the quiet solitude of brick and lamplight. Inside, my world was a fortress of order. Law books stood in silent, leather-bound rows, evidence of a life dedicated to logic, to precedence, to the clear line between right and wrong. At 1 a.m., that line was irrevocably blurred. The sound that broke the silence wasn't the polite rap of a late-night visitor. It was a frantic, desperate drumming, a sound so weak yet so full of terror that it bypassed my ears and went straight to my heart. I moved through the dark hallway, my hand already on the phone, my mind cycling through a dozen rational possibilities, none of which prepared me for the reality on my doorstep. When I pulled the heavy oak door open, the world tilted. It was Alice. My Alice. But a version of her I had only seen in my darkest nightmares. The rain had plastered her blonde hair to her face, which was a shattered mosaic of grief and pain. A grotesque, purple bruise was blooming on her cheekbone, a stark violation against her pale skin. Her designer coat was torn at the shoulder, and she was shivering, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. She didn't speak. She simply fell forward, her strength giving out as if the sight of me had finally allowed her to break. I caught her, my arms wrapping around her trembling frame, pulling her out of the storm and into the safety of my home. The smell of rain and something metallic, fear, clung to her. I kicked the door shut, locking out the world, locking in the disaster that had just arrived. "Mom," she choked out, her voice raw, her face buried in my shoulder. That single word held a universe of pain. I led her to the sofa, my mind a maelstrom of emotions. The part of me that was a mother screamed in silent rage. The part that was a judge began to take notes. I saw the distinct ugly marks of fingers on her upper arm where he must have grabbed her. I saw a cut on her lip, swollen and split. I saw the vacancy in her eyes, the look of someone whose spirit had been profoundly wounded. I wrapped her in a heavy cashmere blanket and put a warm mug of tea in her hands, which she held without drinking. For a long time, she just sat there, staring into the middle distance while the storm raged outside and in. I didn't push. I waited. In a courtroom, silence is a tool. In my living room that night, it was a sanctuary. Finally, she looked at me, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "He found out I knew," she whispered. "About the other woman. I confronted him, Mom. I was so stupid." "You were not stupid, Alice," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You were brave." He laughed at me," she sobbed, the words tumbling out now. "He said she was more of a woman than I'd ever be. And then he hit me. He did this, Mom. Because of her." That was it. The final piece of testimony. I held my daughter, rocked her gently as the sobs racked her body, but inside me, a switch had been flipped. The screaming, panicked mother receded, and something else took her place. Something colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. I had watched Stephen Hayes charm his way into my daughter's life, I'd noted the predator's smile that never quite reached his eyes, the subtle ways he would diminish her accomplishments while building his own empire. I had warned her, in the gentle coded language that mothers use, but love had been blind. Now her eyes were open, and so were mine. After I gave her a mild sedative and tucked her into the guest room, watching her finally succumb to an exhausted, troubled sleep, I walked back downstairs. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one I was about to unleash. It would be a calculated, precise, and inescapable storm. And it would have a single target. Standing in the silent hallway outside my daughter's room, I listened for a moment to the steady rhythm of her breathing. It was the only sound of peace in a house suddenly filled with the echoes of violence. Every instinct I had as a mother wanted me to stay, to sit by her side until morning, to be the shield between her and the nightmares that were surely gathering. But the comfort she needed now wasn't the warmth of a blanket or a soothing word. The only comfort that would truly matter was justice. And that was a task for the other part of me. I turned away from her door and walked down the grand staircase, my hand gliding over the cool, smooth wood of the banister. My footsteps were silent on the thick Persian rug, but in my mind, they sounded like the heavy beat of a war drum. I didn't go to the kitchen for a drink or to the living room to pace. I went to the one room in the house that was unequivocally mine, my study. This room was my sanctuary, my fortress of intellect. The walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with the accumulated wisdom and folly of the law. Books on torts, on constitutional precedent, on the dark intricacies of the criminal mind. The air smelled of old leather and paper. It was a room of logic, of facts, of evidence presented and weighed. But tonight, a fire of pure primal emotion burned within its calm, orderly walls. The grief for my daughter, the white-hot rage at the man who had hurt her, these feelings were a chaotic storm. In this room, I would not extinguish that storm. I would channel it. I would turn the chaotic energy of a mother's pain into the focused, deliberate, and unstoppable force of a judge's will. My eyes fell upon the tall, narrow closet where I kept my professional attire. I passed over the tailored suits and silk blouses and reached for the one garment that defined me. I pulled it out, the heavy black fabric unfolding like a shadow. My judicial robe. To others, it is a symbol of office, a tradition. To me, it has always been more. It is a mantle of responsibility, a physical reminder of the weight of the decisions I make. It is armor. I slipped it on. The familiar weight settled onto my shoulders, and an immediate, profound shift occurred within me. The trembling in my hands ceased. The frantic beating of my heart slowed to a steady, resolute rhythm. Dressed in the robes of my office, in the quiet solitude of my own home, I was no longer just a mother in anguish. The personal had become professional. The pain had become purpose. Stephen Hayes had assaulted my daughter, Alice. But Judge Holloway would be the one to answer. I walked to my mahogany desk, the robe sweeping silently behind me. I sat in the worn leather chair that had molded to my shape over thousands of hours of study and contemplation. And I thought of the contingency I had created 5 years ago, a file born of a flicker of unease at a family dinner. A file I had prayed to God I would never have to open. We called it the Holloway Protocol. It wasn't a plan for revenge. Revenge is messy, emotional. The protocol was a blueprint for deconstruction. A series of carefully orchestrated steps to dismantle a man's life, not with a sledgehammer, but with the surgical precision of a scalpel, all just within the hazy gray lines of the law. I picked up the secure phone on my desk, a direct line that was encrypted and untraceable. I dialed the number from memory. It rang only once. Yes. His voice was calm, awake, and instantly professional. David Chen. My former law clerk, a man with a mind as sharp as a diamond and a loyalty as unyielding as granite. He knew I would never call this line unless it was a matter of the gravest importance. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I let the silence hang for a beat, the unspoken gravity of the situation passing between us. My voice, when I spoke, was devoid of any emotion except for a cold, hard finality. David, I said. It's time. Activate the Holloway Protocol. There was no hesitation on his end. No questions asked. Only a quiet, resolute acknowledgement. Understood, Judge. The process is in motion. I hung up the phone, the click echoing in the silent room. I sat there for a long moment, cloaked in the darkness and the fabric of the law. Outside, the rain had begun to subside. It didn't matter. I had just summoned a hurricane. As I sat there in the silent fortress of my study, the die now cast and the wheels of a terrible justice beginning to turn, my mind traveled back through time. It drifted away from the broken woman sleeping upstairs and landed on a night 5 years ago. A night of glittering crystal and false smiles. A night that should have been one of the happiest of my life, but instead planted the first cold seeds of dread in my soul. It was the night of Alice and Stephen's engagement dinner. The restaurant was one of those obscenely expensive places in downtown D.C. where power and influence were the main items on the menu. The air was thick with the scent of money and fine food. Laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses echoed softly around us. From the outside, we were the perfect picture. The brilliant tech mogul, the beautiful art curator, and the proud mother of the bride-to-be. Alice was incandescent, her face lit with a kind of pure, unadulterated joy that I hadn't seen since she was a child. She looked at Stephen as if he had personally hung the moon in the sky just for her. And he, in turn, played the part of the devoted fiancé to perfection. He was captivating, I had to admit. He held the table, including some of my oldest friends, in the palm of his hand, telling a charming story about the early days of his company, Omnicore. He was handsome, articulate, and radiated an aura of success that was almost intoxicating. Everyone was enchanted. But a judge is trained to look for what is not said, to observe the subtle tells that betray the performance. And as I watched him, a cold knot began to tighten in my stomach. The first tremor of unease came disguised as a joke. He was recounting the story of how he and Alice had found their first apartment. "And there's my brilliant Alice," he said, laughing as he squeezed her hand. "So busy making sure the art would look good on the walls that she almost signed a lease for a place with no plumbing." Everyone chuckled. Alice blushed and swatted his arm playfully. It seemed harmless, a sweet little anecdote. But I saw it for what it was, a subtle act of diminishment. In front of our friends and her mother, he had framed her as the flighty artist and himself as the grounded, practical genius. He was defining her, curating her public identity, and she was so in love, she didn't even see it happening. Later, Alice's phone buzzed. It was a call from her best friend since college. Before Alice could even reach for her purse, Stephen had the phone in his hand. He glanced at the screen and smiled, that perfect, dazzling smile. "Let's let her enjoy the moment," he said to the table, before answering the call. "Hey Sarah," he said, his voice like warm honey. "She's right here, just completely swept up in all this. I'll have her call you tomorrow, I promise." He hung up and slid the phone into his own pocket. "Just us tonight," he said, winking at Alice. She melted. I felt a chill. It wasn't romantic. It was an act of isolation, expertly performed under the guise of devotion. He was cutting the tethers to her support system, one by one. The final piece of evidence, the one that confirmed the terrifying truth taking shape in my mind, was almost imperceptible. A young waiter, clearly nervous serving our table, was refilling our water glasses when his hand stumbled, spilling a single tiny drop of red wine on the cuff of Stephen's immaculate white shirt. It was nothing. A speck. Stephen's reaction was immediate. His charming smile didn't falter, he laughed it off, telling the terrified waiter, "Don't worry about it, son, it happens." But I wasn't looking at his mouth. I was looking at his eyes. For less than a second, before the mask of charm snapped back into place, I saw a flash of something utterly chilling. It was a look of pure, reptilian fury. A rage so intense and so disproportionate to the minor offense that it made the breath catch in my throat. In that split second, I saw the real Stephen Hayes. The monster he kept caged just behind his teeth. I left the dinner that night with a smile plastered on my face and a core of ice in my gut. Everyone else saw a perfect match. I saw a predator who had found his prey. The next morning, I called David Chen into my chambers. My voice was calm and professional. I told him that as a matter of due diligence, considering the high-profile nature of my future son-in-law, I wanted a deep, confidential, and ongoing file opened on him. Just a precaution, David, I had said. Let's call it the Holloway Protocol. It was the beginning of the secret war I had been quietly waging ever since, a war that, tonight, had finally broken out into the open. The call ended, but the connection remained. I didn't need to be in the room with David Chen to know what was happening. Miles away, in a nondescript office building that hummed with the quiet power of servers and satellites, a war had begun. David is not an investigator who kicks down doors or confronts thugs in dark alleys. His battlefield is the digital world, a landscape of encrypted files, firewalls, and the silent, flowing rivers of money that connect the global elite. He is a ghost in the machine, and his work is an art form. My instructions to him 5 years ago, at the inception of the Holloway Protocol, had been precise. We would not gather gossip. We would not trade in rumors. We would gather only hard, verifiable data. Financial statements, incorporation papers, flight manifests, property deeds. We built a secret architecture of facts around Stephen Hayes, a shadow file that detailed the truth behind the glittering facade of Omnicore. And now, in the pre-dawn hours of this terrible day, David was accessing that arsenal. The first move in any well-planned assault is never the most obvious one. To attack Stephen over his affair, over what he did to Alice, would have been a tactical error. He would have been prepared for that. He would have twisted it, used his army of lawyers and public relations experts to paint Alice as unhinged, as a scorned woman seeking to ruin a great man. It would have become a messy, public spectacle, his territory. I would not fight him on his terms. I would fight him on mine. A man like Stephen Hayes doesn't truly value love. He values power. His identity, his ego, his very sense of self were not built on his marriage, but on the soaring stock price of his company. Omnicore was his kingdom, his monument, his shield. And that is where the first blow had to land. Not on his heart, but on his foundation. I pictured David at his desk, bathed in the cool blue light of his monitors. On one screen would be the public face of Omnicore, glowing press releases, robust quarterly earnings reports, interviews with Stephen hailing him as a visionary. On the other screens, the truth. The intricate web of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands that he'd set up years ago. The quiet, but consistent, siphoning of corporate funds into a private account in Switzerland, disguised as consulting fees. The real estate purchases made through anonymous LLCs. Individually, each transaction was a footnote, perhaps questionable but deniable. But together, woven by David's expert hands from the threads I had been collecting for years, they formed a tapestry of breathtaking fraud. He wouldn't need to dig for days. The work was already done. The protocol was not a map to find the treasure. It was the treasure waiting to be used. His task tonight was simply to choose the sharpest weapon from the armory. He found it in a series of wire transfers between Omnicore and a shell company named Helios Assets. The transfers were designated for research and development, but Helios Assets had no employees, no office, and its only director was an attorney known for specializing in hiding the wealth of corrupt politicians. The Helios account, in turn, had been used to fund the down payment on a lavish penthouse in Manhattan, the very penthouse I knew his mistress had been living in for the past year. The information was packaged with lethal precision. No frantic, rambling accusations. David compiled a clean, professional digital file, a timeline, scanned incorporation documents, copies of the wire transfers, and a short, dispassionate summary that laid out the undeniable facts. It was the kind of file a federal prosecutor would weep with joy to receive. But we weren't sending it to the authorities. Not yet. The legal system is my domain, but it is slow. My judgment would be swifter. The file was encrypted and uploaded to a secure server. From there, it was sent as an anonymous, untraceable tip. The recipient was a woman at the Wall Street Journal, a journalist named Sarah O'Connell, known for her tenacity and her Pulitzer Prize-winning series on corporate corruption. She was a bloodhound. And I had just given her the scent of a lifetime. I closed my eyes, picturing the email landing in her inbox. It sat there, a quiet, digital bombshell. The first domino had been pushed. It hadn't fallen yet, but I could feel the tremor of its impending impact all the way from my study. The world thought Stephen Hayes was invincible. They were about to learn that every foundation, no matter how high it seems, has a breaking point. The dawn that followed that terrible night broke gray and unforgiving over the city. The rain had passed, leaving behind a world that felt washed out and fragile. I found Alice in the kitchen, staring into a mug of coffee she hadn't touched. The swelling on her cheek was a darker, angrier purple. In the stark morning light, the reality of what had happened felt somehow more brutal, more concrete. She looked small and lost in my large, quiet house. She was safe, for the moment. But safety and sanctuary are two different things. Stephen would be waking up soon, if he had slept at all. He would discover Alice was gone. His first reaction would be rage, followed quickly by calculation. He would call, he would text, he would email. He would deploy a deluge of apologies, threats, and manipulations. A carefully crafted campaign to lure her back before she could think for herself, before she could build her walls high enough. My home in Georgetown was a fortress, but it was still on his map. We needed to disappear from it entirely. "Pack a bag, Alice," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Just the essentials. We're leaving for a while." She looked up, her eyes wide with a fear I recognized. The fear of a caged bird who has forgotten it can fly. "Where are we going?" "He'll find me." "No," I said, with a certainty that I hoped would be contagious. "He will not. We're going to the one place he doesn't know about. We're going to the lake house." The Blue Ridge Mountains were our family's oldest sanctuary. My husband and I had bought the small, rustic cabin decades ago, a world away from the relentless ambition of Washington, D.C. It was a place of pine-scented air, of cold, clear water, of nights so dark you could see the sweep of the Milky Way. It had no address that could be found on a GPS. It was a place of healing, where generations of Holloways had gone to mend broken hearts and weary souls. It was the perfect place to turn a victim into a warrior. The drive was long and silent. I watched as the concrete jungle of the city gave way to the rolling hills and dense forests of Virginia. With each mile we put between us and him, I felt a subtle shift in Alice. The rigid terror in her shoulders began to soften. She was breathing more deeply. When we finally arrived, pulling up the long gravel driveway to the familiar wooden cabin, she took a deep breath of the mountain air. It was the first real breath I'd seen her take in 24 hours. For the first day, I did nothing. I let her sleep, let her sit by the stone fireplace, let her watch the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. I let the profound, ancient quiet of the mountains begin its work on her spirit. This was protection. But protection alone was not enough. The second phase of my plan required more than a passive victim. It required an active participant. On the second evening, a discreet sedan made its way up our hidden drive. The woman who stepped out was named Margaret Shaw. She was not a flashy D.C. divorce attorney. She was a quiet, silver-haired woman with eyes that missed nothing, a lawyer renowned in certain circles for one thing: surgically dismantling powerful, abusive men in court. I had brought her here not to talk about settlements, but to talk about war. After Margaret had left, leaving Alice with a clear understanding of the legal battle ahead, I sat down opposite my daughter. I placed a simple leather-bound journal and a pen on the table between us. "This is your most important weapon now," I told her. "More important than any lawyer. Stephen has controlled your story for years. Now, you will write it yourself." She looked at the blank book, her expression hesitant. "What do I write?" "That he hurt me." "You write everything," I said, my voice imbued with the quiet authority of my courtroom. "Every time he belittled you in front of friends. Every time he took your phone to see who you were talking to. Every business trip that felt wrong. Every expensive gift he bought after a terrible fight. Every whispered, angry comment. The names of his business partners he seemed afraid of. The passwords you might have seen. Dates, times, locations. Don't write it like a diary, Alice. Write it like you are building a case against an enemy. Because that is exactly what you are doing. I saw a flicker in her eyes. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something new. The first tiny spark of anger, of righteous fury. It was the spark I had been waiting for. She picked up the pen. She opened the journal. And she began to write. The physical bruises on my daughter's face were already starting to heal, but the work we were doing now, in the quiet sanctuary of the mountains, was meant to heal the deeper wounds and, in doing so, to forge the very weapons we would use to bring him down. For 3 days, the world outside our mountain sanctuary ceased to exist. Our rhythm was dictated by the rising sun and the crackle of the fireplace. Alice filled page after page of her journal, the steady scratching of her pen a quiet act of rebellion. With every memory she put on paper, I saw a little of the haunted look in her eyes recede, replaced by a glimmer of resolve. We were in a holding pattern, a pocket of calm before the first planned detonation. The signal came on the 4th morning, not with a bang, but with a quiet chime from my encrypted laptop. I had been tracking Sarah O'Connell's byline. The article was live. I opened the link, and there it was, splashed across the front page of the Wall Street Journal's digital edition. The headline was a work of art, a masterpiece of journalistic precision that implied everything while stating nothing definitively. The Omnicore miracle, innovation or opaque financial engineering? It was perfect. O'Connell hadn't gone with the salacious affair angle. That would have been too easy for Stephen to dismiss. Instead, she had followed the money, just as I knew she would. The article was a dry, methodical dissection of Omnicore's corporate structure. It meticulously detailed the web of offshore shell companies, including a pointed focus on Helios assets. It didn't accuse Stephen of a crime. It simply asked questions. Why did a tech company need such a convoluted financial structure? What research and development was being conducted by a company with no employees? Why were millions of dollars flowing through untraceable Caribbean accounts? It started, I said quietly. Alice came to stand behind me, her hand resting on my shoulder as she read the words on the screen. Will people believe it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. They don't have to believe it, I explained, scrolling through the article. They just have to start asking the same questions. A man like Stephen isn't sustained by love or loyalty. He's sustained by confidence. Investor confidence, board confidence, public confidence. This article is a solvent designed to dissolve that confidence. The initial shockwaves were subtle, visible only to those who knew where to look. I watched the Omnicore stock ticker on a financial news site. It dipped, just a few points at first, then a few more. It wasn't a crash, but a nervous wobble, the first tremor of fear in a market that despises uncertainty. On professional networks and private investor forums, the conversation began. The article was being shared, dissected, and debated. The first crack in Stephen's immaculate public armor had appeared. Of course, he didn't wait long to respond. His ego would never allow a challenge like this to go unanswered. By midday, his office had scheduled an emergency press conference. We watched the live stream from the lake house, the two of us a silent jury observing the proceedings from afar. He strode to the podium, looking immaculate. He was the very picture of wronged success, his jaw set, his expression a carefully calibrated mix of disappointment and defiance. He didn't have notes. He never did. I stand before you today, he began, his voice smooth and resonant, not just as the CEO of Omnicore, but as a believer in the American dream. A dream that says if you build something new, if you innovate, if you succeed, you will be celebrated. But it seems a new, more cynical chapter has been added to that dream. If you succeed too much, you will be torn down by those who lack the vision to build. It was a brilliant performance. He never mentioned Helios assets. He never addressed the specific financial questions. Instead, he attacked. He belittled the article as the sad, desperate work of tabloid journalism masquerading as finance. He framed himself as the victim of a media machine that feeds on tearing down success. He was charming. He was forceful. And to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, he was utterly convincing. But I was paying attention. And so was Wall Street. He's making a mistake, I murmured, my eyes narrowed on the screen. He's not answering the question. He's attacking the questioner. Alice looked at me. He sounds so confident. It's not confidence, I corrected her. It's arrogance. He believes he is so far above the accusation that he doesn't need to dignify it with a factual response. He thinks a show of force is the same as a defense. But shrewd investors, the ones with real money on the line, they see that for what it is, evasion. When he finished, there was a smattering of applause from the reporters he had planted in the room. He walked off the stage, thinking he had extinguished the fire. But I knew, with the certainty of a lifelong student of human nature, that he had just thrown a gallon of gasoline onto the embers. The seed of doubt had been sown, and his arrogant performance had just watered it. The world was now watching Stephen Hayes, and that was exactly what I wanted. The fallout from Stephen's press conference was exactly as I had predicted. The financial media, their journalistic integrity questioned, began to dig with renewed vigor. The nervous wobble in Omnicor's stock became a persistent, troubling tremor. We had cracked the foundation. Now, it was time to apply a more personal pressure. It was time to give the enemy a face and a name. The public battle was my domain, but the key to the next phase lay locked in my daughter's memory. For days, Alice had been pouring her pain and confusion into the journal, and in doing so, something remarkable had happened. The process of writing had transformed her memories from traumatic, emotional flashes into something more akin to evidence. The pages were no longer just filled with sorrow, they were filled with data. That evening, as a cool mountain breeze rustled the pines outside, I sat with her by the fire. Alice, I began gently, I want you to think back. Not about the fights, but about the quiet moments. The times he was on the phone, when he thought you weren't listening. She closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. He was always on the phone, she said, a bitter edge to her voice. Always walking into another room, speaking in that low voice he used for important business. What kind of business? I pressed. Any words you remember? Names? Places? He used code names a lot, she recalled, her eyes still closed. I always thought it was just him being dramatic, trying to sound important. There was one. Project Nightingale. He mentioned it a lot over the summer. And a place. Geneva. He would ask, has the package for Geneva been secured? She paused, and a new look of clarity crossed her face. There was a name, she said, her voice now a strained whisper. Once. He was furious about something, pacing back and forth. He said, damn it, Isabella, you knew the risks were part of the deal. He never said that name again. Isabella. The name hung in the air between us. Anything else? I asked, keeping my voice even, masking the thrill of the hunt. No matter how small. It's stupid, she said, shaking her head. Try me. He came home from a trip once and complained that his suit smelled of perfume. He said, I swear, that woman bathes in gardenias. He was so specific. It was weird. Project Nightingale. Geneva. Isabella. The scent of gardenias. They were fragmented, disparate clues, the kind a police detective might dismiss. But to an intelligence gatherer like David, they were the coordinates for a map. I transmitted the fragments to him immediately, using a secure messaging app. I didn't have to provide context or instructions. I simply gave him the puzzle pieces. The reply came less than 12 hours later. It was a single, encrypted file. I opened it with Alice looking over my shoulder. On the screen was a sleek, professional dossier. At the top was a photograph of a woman with sharp features, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and an expression that radiated ambition and intelligence. Below it, the text was a series of devastating bombshells. Name: Isabella Rossi. Position: Chief Financial Officer, Cybercorp. Cybercorp. Omnicore's largest and most bitter rival. My blood ran cold. David's summary was brutally efficient. He had cross-referenced the name with high-level female executives in the tech industry. He found that Isabella Rossi had given a keynote speech in Singapore on the exact dates of one of Stephen's business trips. He discovered that Project Nightingale was the internal codename for Cybercorp's revolutionary new microchip, a project so secret it was rumored to be years ahead of anything Omnicore had in development. And the final chilling detail: David's research showed that a numbered Swiss bank account in Geneva had received a series of large, untraceable payments, funneled through the same shell corporations Stephen used, the ones tied to Helios assets. Alice let out a small, strangled gasp. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "It wasn't just an affair." "No," I said, my eyes fixed on the cold, calculating face of Isabella Rossi. "It was never just an affair. The betrayal was so much deeper, so much more venomous than we could have imagined. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a strategic alliance. A conspiracy." Stephen hadn't just been cheating on his wife. He and the CFO of his biggest competitor were actively engaged in corporate espionage, sharing proprietary data to manipulate markets and cripple his own company for their mutual gain. The domestic abuser was also a traitor to his own empire. The stakes of our secret war had just magnified tenfold. Stephen was not just a cruel husband. He was a major criminal. He was more dangerous than Alice had ever known. But in his greed, he had also made himself infinitely more vulnerable. We now had a second target, and the path to his destruction had just become terrifyingly clear. The discovery of Isabella Rossi's involvement was the fulcrum upon which our entire strategy shifted. This was no longer just about exposing a fraud. It was about dismantling a criminal conspiracy. The first article in the Wall Street Journal was the smoke, a signal designed to create confusion and attract attention. Now that the world was watching, it was time to light the fire. I explained to Alice that public opinion is a fickle beast. Stephen's charm could, eventually, win it back. But there are forces that even a man like him cannot charm. Our next move would be silent, invisible to the public, but it would strike at the very heart of his power. Our target was no longer the press. It was the federal government. "A news story is a public wound," I told her, as we sat in the quiet of the lake house study. "But a federal investigation is a poison that works from the inside out. It creates paranoia, it turns allies against each other, and it forces its victim to spend millions defending himself against a ghost." I instructed David to assemble a new, more potent dossier. He took the original evidence of financial malpractice, the shell companies, the Helios assets transactions, and wove it together with the explosive new proof of corporate espionage. He included travel manifests placing Stephen and Isabella in the same foreign cities on the same dates, cross-referencing them with key development milestones for Cybercorp's Project Nightingale. He created a timeline so clear and damning that it left no room for interpretation. It was a story of two rival executives conspiring to defraud their own companies and the public markets. This package was not sent to a journalist. It was uploaded, through the same untraceable channels, to the official whistleblower portal of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Unlike last time, there was no immediate, visible result. The news cycle continued, Omnicore's stock stabilized at its new lower value, and for a few days, a tense silence fell. "I don't understand," Alice said, scanning the news feeds on her tablet. "Nothing happened." "Exactly," I replied, a grim sense of satisfaction settling over me. "The SEC doesn't hold press conferences to announce an investigation. They move in absolute silence. Right now, somewhere in a quiet government office, a team of forensic accountants is looking at what we sent. Subpoenas are being drafted. Every board member at Omnicore is about to receive a visit from men in conservative suits asking polite, but terrifyingly specific, questions. The pressure on Stephen now isn't coming from the outside world. It's coming from inside his own boardroom. He's bleeding, Alice. He just can't see the wound yet. A man like Stephen Hayes feeds on more than just money and power. He feeds on admiration. He requires an audience. His carefully curated friendships in the halls of Washington, D.C. were not about camaraderie. They were about access and validation. The SEC investigation was a silent, internal pressure. It was time to create a public, external one. It was time to make him a pariah. I left Alice in the secure tranquility of the mountains and returned to the city for a single, strategic evening. The occasion was the Congressional Charity Gala, the glittering centerpiece of the D.C. social season. It was the perfect hunting ground, a room filled with the very people Stephen considered his peers and protectors. My goal was not to spread rumors. That is the clumsy tool of the powerless. My power in these circles is built on decades of integrity and discretion. And that is the very weapon I chose to use. Dressed in a simple, elegant black gown, I was a picture of somber dignity. People naturally approached me, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. "Jean, how are you? And how is dear Alice?" they would ask. This was the opening I needed. My performance was subtle. To the wife of a powerful senator, I put a hand on her arm, my expression etched with weary concern. Alice is taking some time for herself. To be honest, this business with Omnicore, the pressure has put Stephen in a terribly volatile state. We're all quite worried. To a banking executive who sat on 2 major boards, I murmured, I do hope his partners are providing him the support he needs. Stress of this magnitude can make a man so unpredictable. I never mentioned the abuse. I never spoke of the affair or the corporate espionage. I only planted one, carefully chosen seed in the fertile ground of gossip. Stephen Hayes is unstable. In the risk-averse world of Washington power, unstable is a death sentence. The word spread through the ballroom like a contagion. An expression of grave concern from Judge Jean Holloway carried more weight than 1,000 tabloid headlines. The effects were immediate and exquisitely satisfying. My sources confirmed that a planned fishing trip with a cabinet secretary was quietly cancelled. Stephen's invitation to a private, high-stakes poker game with lobbyists was lost in the mail. He was being politely and ruthlessly ostracized. The social armor he had spent a decade building was being stripped away, piece by piece. We had attacked his finances and sicked the federal government on him. Now, we were taking his friends. He was being made into an island, and the tide was still rising. A cornered predator is the most dangerous. Stephen Hayes, bleeding money, besieged by federal investigators, and shunned by the very society that once adored him, was finally cornered. He had been absorbing blows, trying to deflect and charm his way out of a crisis of his own making. That time was over. Now he would lash out. The attack did not come as a phone call or a threatening email. It was far more formal and brutal. A county sheriff's car rolling up our secluded gravel driveway was a jarring intrusion, a violation of our sanctuary. The officer who approached the door was polite, but his purpose was hostile. He served Alice with a thick legal envelope. It was not just a response to her divorce petition. It was a declaration of war. I watched the color drain from Alice's face as she read. It was a vicious countersuit, a masterwork of character assassination penned by the most ruthless lawyers money could buy. Page after page of sworn, perjured affidavits painted Alice as a vindictive and mentally unstable woman. It accused her of corporate espionage, twisting her knowledge of his crimes into a weapon against her. It alleged substance abuse problems and emotional hysteria. It ended with a petition for an emergency restraining order, framing her as the violent, threatening party. For a moment, I saw the old fear return. This was the voice of her abuser, amplified and legitimized by the seal of the court. It was designed to make her feel insane and powerless. But where Alice saw a monster, I saw a fatal tactical error. "Do not read this with your heart, Alice," I said, my voice a blade of ice as I took the document from her trembling hands. "Read this as a legal filing. This is not an act of strength. It is an act of blind panic." I spread the papers on the table. He has no evidence for any of this. These are lies, and lies can be dismantled. In filing this, he has just committed himself to a legal battle where he will be forced, under oath, to answer for them. His attack was meant to shatter her. Instead, it forged her. Seeing his cruelty written in such cold, legalistic language, seeing him try to twist reality itself, extinguished the last of her fear. It was replaced by a cold, hard anger. The fire I had seen in her was no longer a spark. It was an inferno. Stephen thought he could intimidate his victim into silence. He had just ensured that his victim would now do whatever it took to become his executioner. Stephen's legal assault was designed to break Alice's spirit. Instead, it sharpened her mind. The lies he put on paper were so audacious, so contrary to the reality she had lived, that they acted like a key, unlocking rooms in her memory that had been sealed by trauma and fear. For 2 days, she obsessively reread the documents, not with the terror of a victim, but with the forensic focus of an investigator. It wasn't the personal attacks that did it. It was a small, almost trivial lie buried deep in a financial appendix. A reference to something called the Lexington Project, which Stephen's lawyers had dismissed as a failed internal venture, a costly write-off. But Alice knew that was wrong. She remembered the Lexington Project. She remembered the manic energy that had seized Stephen when he worked on it, the late-night hushed phone calls, the way his eyes had gleamed with a predatory excitement. He hadn't treated it like a failure. He had treated it like his masterstroke. The lie was a crack in the wall of her memory, and suddenly, everything came flooding through. An image, sharp and vivid. Stephen, in their home office a year ago, thinking she was asleep. He was holding a sleek, silver flash drive. He looked at it not like a piece of technology, but like a treasure. Then, he walked to the back of the closet, pulled out his father's old worn leather briefcase, a sentimental item he never used, and carefully locked the flash drive inside. The next day, the briefcase was gone. "The storage unit," Alice said, her voice electric with discovery as she slammed the legal papers onto the table. He took that old briefcase to the storage unit in Rockville. It was a brilliant hiding place. In a divorce, lawyers would inventory their home, their bank accounts, their known properties. No one would think to search for a digital key inside a worthless physical artifact in an anonymous off-site locker. I immediately saw the legal path forward. "His lawsuit gives us the opening," I said, my mind racing. "As part of the discovery process, you have the legal right to retrieve your personal effects. We will file a motion, and the court will grant you supervised access." 2 days later, we stood before the cold, corrugated metal door of the storage unit, a bored-looking police officer standing a few feet away, ensuring the peace. Stephen's lawyer was there, smug and condescending, clearly believing this was a desperate, emotional whim. The door rolled up with a loud groan, revealing a tightly packed cube of their shared life. Furniture, boxes of old photos, forgotten wedding gifts. Alice walked through the narrow aisle between the stacks, her eyes scanning everything. And there, in the back corner, was the old leather briefcase. Her hands were steady as she lifted it. "This is mine," she said, her voice clear and firm. "It was a gift from his father to me." The lawyer scoffed but had no legal grounds to object. Back in the car, Alice placed the briefcase on her lap. She clicked open the latches. Inside, nestled amongst old yellowed papers, was the small, cold piece of silver metal. It felt impossibly heavy in her hand, heavy with the weight of secrets. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not a trace of the broken woman who had collapsed on my doorstep. I saw a reflection of myself. She had just captured the enemy's entire war chest. The silver flash drive was a Pandora's box, and David Chen was the only one with the key. From his remote office, he spent hours methodically dismantling the layers of military-grade encryption Stephen had used to protect his secrets. When he finally broke through, he didn't call. He simply sent me a secure link to a virtual data room. What I saw there was not just a smoking gun. It was a thermonuclear device. The drive contained 3 meticulously organized folders. The first was labeled Nightingale. It held the complete, unvarnished ledger of the corporate espionage plot with Isabella Rossi. Every stolen trade secret, every manipulated stock price, every single dollar transferred to their shared account in Geneva. It was a prosecutor's dream, a signed confession to a litany of federal crimes that would put them both in prison for decades. The second folder, labeled Senator, was even more vile. It contained audio recordings and compromising photographs of a powerful U.S. senator, evidence of a long-standing blackmail operation. Stephen had used this material to force the senator to champion legislation that directly paved the way for Omnicore's explosive growth, effectively corrupting our government for his own personal gain. But it was the third folder that stopped my heart. It was labeled simply Holloway versus Markin. It was a corporate merger case. A complex, difficult case that I, Judge Jean Holloway, had presided over 6 years ago. The files inside proved that the senator's manipulated political maneuvering had directly impacted the evidence and testimony presented in my courtroom. Stephen hadn't just broken the law. He had reached into my past and made a mockery of my life's work, using his corruption to taint the very sanctity of my judgment. I stared at the screen, a cold, crystalline rage solidifying within me. This was the final missing piece. This was the evidence that wove all of his crimes together into a single, horrifying tapestry of a sociopath who believed he was above the law. This was checkmate. The Nightingale ledger was for the SEC. The blackmail material on the senator would be delivered to the one person with more to lose than Stephen, the senator himself. And the proof of his interference in my case, that was the personal seal on a judgment from which there would be no appeal. The game was over. All that was left was to watch the king fall. With the evidence secured, it was time to end the charade. A man like Stephen needed to be shown, not just told, that he had lost. We arranged what his legal team believed would be a contentious divorce mediation. He would have relished the invitation, striding into the room expecting to financially bully and psychologically intimidate a broken woman. He wasn't walking into a negotiation. He was walking into his own sentencing. The meeting was held in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at a prestigious neutral law firm. Stephen arrived flanked by his legal sharks, wearing a suit like armor and a smirk like a weapon. He pushed open the door and stopped dead. The smugness on his face evaporated, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had expected to see only Alice and her lawyer. Instead, he found a tribunal. Alice sat beside her counsel, Margaret Shaw, her posture radiating a calm strength he had never seen before. Next to them sat the grim-faced lead attorneys for Omnicore's board of directors. And at the head of the long table, I sat, a silent observer whose very presence changed the nature of the room from a legal mediation to a final judgment. There was no preamble, no small talk. "Let's begin," Margaret said, her voice crisp. She slid a single printed summary across the polished table. Exhibit A, a full ledger of transactions between Helios assets and a Geneva bank account, cross-referenced with stolen intellectual property from Cybercorp. Stephen's lawyers flinched. Before they could speak, Margaret slid over a second paper, a single, high-resolution still image from a video. Exhibit B, the contents of your blackmail file on a sitting United States senator. The color drained from Stephen's face. He stared at the picture, then at me. Finally, Margaret placed a third document on the table. It was a court filing from the Holloway versus Markin case. And Exhibit C, proof of your direct interference in a federal case. I watched him. The mask of the Titan, the genius, the indomitable man, simply crumbled. In his eyes, I saw the frantic calculations of a cornered rat realizing there was no escape, no angle left to play. He looked at his lawyers, who were staring at the documents in mute horror. He looked at Alice, and saw not a victim he could control, but the woman who had brought his entire world crashing down. Finally, his desperate gaze met mine. I gave him nothing. No anger, no triumph. Just the cold finality of the law. "There are no more moves to make, Stephen," I said quietly. He didn't protest. He didn't speak. He simply slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out king in a ruined kingdom, finally forced to look upon the checkmate he had never seen coming. The silence in that conference room was the deep, heavy calm before a tsunami. Stephen, stripped of all his illusions, made one last, desperate, and predictable move. He tried to run. We had anticipated it. An anonymous tip to the FBI, complete with the tail number and flight plan of his private jet, was the final move in our game. He didn't even make it inside the plane. Federal agents intercepted him on the tarmac at Dulles International Airport, in full view of the public terminals. There was no dramatic chase, no shouted commands. Just the quiet, humiliating click of handcuffs and the flash of news cameras from reporters we had also alerted. The great Stephen Hayes, the titan of technology, was led away like a common fugitive. His arrest broke the dam. Within an hour, the story was an all-consuming media firestorm. The SEC, acting on the evidence and likely pressured by a suddenly cooperative senator, unsealed their formal investigation. The charges were staggering: securities fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud. Across the country, in a coordinated move, Isabella Rossi was quietly arrested in her glass-walled office at Cybercorp. The dominoes fell with breathtaking speed. The senator, in a desperate act of self-preservation, held a press conference, claiming he had been the victim of a vicious and sustained extortion plot. He positioned himself as a key witness for the prosecution, throwing Stephen into the fire to save himself. The effect on Omnicore was cataclysmic. Before the stock market could even open, trading on its shares was permanently halted. The board of directors resigned en masse. The tech empire, built on a foundation of stolen data and corrupted politics, had evaporated in less than 12 hours. From the sanctuary of the lake house, Alice and I watched the empire burn. We saw his polished corporate photo replaced by a grim, haggard mugshot. We saw news anchors dissect every lie he had ever told. His wealth was frozen. His reputation was obliterated. His freedom was gone. The public judgment was absolute. The man who believed he was a king had lost everything, leaving nothing behind but the smoking ruins of his own colossal arrogance. The wheels of justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. A year later, the courts did their work. Stephen Hayes was sentenced to 30 years in a federal penitentiary, his appeals exhausted, his name now a permanent synonym for corporate greed and personal cruelty. Isabella Rossi, in exchange for her testimony, received a lesser but still substantial sentence. The legal chapter was officially closed. But the true victory was not won in a courtroom. It was won here tonight, under the warm lights of a converted warehouse in the city's arts district. The sign outside read, "The Holloway Gallery." Alice had reclaimed her maiden name, and in doing so, had reclaimed herself. The gallery's inaugural exhibition was called Resilience. It featured the powerful, breathtaking work of female artists who had survived domestic abuse, telling their stories not with words, but with paint, sculpture, and photography. The room was full of life, laughter, and the excited buzz of the art world. I stood near the back, a quiet guest, watching my daughter. She moved through the crowd with a grace and confidence that seemed a universe away from the broken woman who had fallen on my doorstep. She was not a victim. She was a founder, a curator, a beacon. She spoke about the art with passion, her smile genuine, her eyes bright with purpose. I thought of the Holloway Protocol, that cold and intricate machine of retribution I had built and unleashed. I had orchestrated the destruction of a man and his empire. But I knew now, with absolute certainty, that it was never about the act of destruction. It was about clearing the ground. It was about rooting out a poison so that something new and beautiful could grow. It was all for this. For this room, for this art, for the brilliant and unbreakable light that had returned to my daughter's eyes. She saw me and made her way through the crowd. She took my hand, her grip firm and warm. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. I shook my head, my heart full. "You did this, Alice. You built this." Our story did not truly begin on that terrible, rainy night of violence. It ended there. The real story, Alice's story, began tonight. Standing side by side, we were no longer a protector and a victim, a judge and a witness. We were a mother and a daughter, two strong, resilient women who had faced the darkness and had chosen to build a new dawn in its place. And it was, in every sense of the word, beautiful.